horrible places to live. But also what was interesting, he also invited 2 young Tibetan nuns who, as you know, Tibetans the last 50, 60 years have been, under the hands of the Chinese communists, so it's pretty intense, and they were in prison for a couple of years, and they'd been tortured and sexually abused in prison for being Buddhist, right? That's the trouble. So anyway, the point is they were telling their story, these young women, and they were very, very quiet, and they were in tears because the suffering was pretty intense. So what was interesting was at the end, one of them then said, and this is the approach for a Buddhist who's trying to be a Buddhist, who's using the view of karma as your explanation for why things happen. She said at the end, they'd tortured, harmed, suffered, brutalised, sexually abused in prison. And this is intense. At the end, one of them said, there were tears, sad, and one of them said, and of course, we had compassion for our torturers because we knew we must have harmed them in the past and because they would suffer in the future for what they did to us. So that's the response of a person who's got the view of karma, which is not instinctive. I mean, we'd rather, understand it's not the view we tend to have. But I remember in Miami, I gave a talk to 20 years ago. There was a group, the topic was why do bad things happen to good people? Well, there was me, a rabbi, a Lutheran and a Catholic.
Sounds like a joke.
I know, it does, doesn't it? And the fact is, it was very interesting. I have to admit, I couldn't understand the Catholic and the Lutheran's answers to why suffering happens why bad things happen to good people, but never mind. But I gave my answer pretty straight, gave a talk about karma, And then the rabbi clapped. And he was cracking jokes about Hitler. I don't think I've heard Jews too often crack jokes about Hitler. But he was cracking jokes about Hitler. And he was an Israeli. And he said that's the Kabbalah Jewish view. He said, we even have a saying. I remember he quoted this. He said, we have a saying, every time something bad happens, you go, great, one less debt to repay. So I think the Jews in the audience were probably gobsmacked. Regular Jews don't know about this. I remember the Dalai Lama had talks with a bunch of the rabbis. He likes to talk to the different religions. And I remember at some point he said, I wish you people would make your teachings more open. And I think he meant, beyond 40-year-old males, because there's only 40-year-old males who do the Kabbalah. Now with Madonna, everything's changed. But you understand, but that's the view in the Jewish teachings. And I remember in Dharamsala, where regularly, 50% of the courses there in our centre are from Israel. I find it so fascinating. I think Israel's going to be a Buddhist country in another generation. It's really funny. Hopefully. It's amazing the number of people who are becoming Buddhists in Israel. I can never get it. I'm speechless. The last course I did, there was like 60% of the 80 people were from Israel. And it's been like that for 20 years in Dharamsala. Anyway, the point is, one of the guys there who's an observant Jew, he's a student doctor, and I'm going to be in Israel in January, and he's invited me to give a talk at his hospital. And he said he looked into it further, and he said it's even in the regular teachings. It's in the text somewhere about reincarnation and things. So it's kind of interesting. It's interesting. You've got to say it's interesting. So his response, great, one less debt to repay. So the point is, if you haven't pulled out the weed and it bloody ripens, your mean old husband or the people kill you, you're really living sincerely according to your view, then that would be your response. And that's those young Tibetan nuns. But and this gets us to the point, I really like to stress this one. That everything in our mind, like I keep saying to several times, I've said to Neil, we have all these assumptions. So the assumption, he was perfect in what he said. He said the assumption is, well, when you can't change. The assumption is it's natural when you feel guilty. Our assumption is, of course you can't prove karma. Our assumption is, of course you can't remember a past life, because we have a whole series of viewpoints in our mind now that believe in the opposite. We don't think we believe in anything, but Buddha says we believe our mind is our brain. He disagrees with it. He says it's a belief. That's a shock to us because we think it's true and scientific. So what I'm getting at is, this is the Buddhist approach, the more we realise what goes on in here, in our mind, our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, our unconscious instinct, all this, it's a series of thoughts at ever subtle levels. And so the more we're familiar with whatever thoughts they are, the more we assume that's just true. We don't analyse it, we don't question it. So the Buddha's point is, whatever goes on in here determines how you experience life. So, there's that rabbi who said those words. That didn't come out of the sky, but out of a philosophical view that he's living according to. Now, I remember a couple of a few years ago, one of those Malaysian airlines went down into the ocean, and all these people drowned. And then one of the couples, they're from Malaysia, they're mostly, you know, what do you call, Muslims. And the mummy and daddy were asked how they felt about the death of their daughter. Well, there they said, we are peaceful. She belongs to God and now he's taken her back. Now, I'm not saying I agree with that, but their response of being peaceful and calm was based on their viewpoints. So that in other words, what goes on in our mind determines how you feel. It's sort of obvious. You know, they were feeling peaceful because they were living according to their philosophical view. Well, the Buddha's saying we're all full of philosophical views. But materialists say, oh, I don't believe in anything. But their minds are riddled with viewpoints. The viewpoint of a materialist, and I'm meaning materialist in a simple sense of a person who says their mind is their brain and their mother made them, who doesn't posit a thing called a soul or conscious or Buddha's view of consciousness, okay? Regular people in our culture. They say literally, maybe one of you guys is the same, oh, I don't have a religion, I don't believe in anything. Well, Buddha says your mind is riddled with beliefs. You believe your mother actually gave you anger. You believe the Catholic nuns are the cause of your suffering. You believe your mind is your brain. You believe you started in your mother's womb. So really what I'm saying is, everybody around the world has all these different viewpoints. We give some of them labels, you know, some Australian Aboriginals have such complex viewpoints. I can't even explain how they think. Their view is so utterly different. So therefore, according to what's in your mind is how you respond. It's sort of, in a sense, not rocket science. But this is why the tragedy is we don't analyse what's going on in our mind. We don't question our assumptions. And then we assume that what we feel is true. Again, Neil's point's the perfect point. Oh, but it's natural. We'd say it's natural that if you're around mean people, you feel bad. It's natural when you do something wrong, you feel guilty. No, it's not natural in the sense that it is natural, but it's based on a series of assumptions in our mind. And that's because the Buddha's view, because the Buddha stresses so much the importance of the mind, then clearly you have to start looking at what you think. And naturally, as you keep looking, you go deeper and deeper and deeper at ever more subtle assumptions. Are we communicating here? Yes. It's just that we don't tend to do this emotionally. I mean, if you're studying maths, if you're studying music, you keep going ever more deeply into the meaning of these things. You get really subtle understanding of music and of maths. You're using your mind, you know. Everything's based on what's in the mind. It's sort of obvious in a sense. So clearly from the Buddhist perspective, all your happiness comes from all your viewpoints in your mind, all your assumptions, and all your suffering comes from the same. So he says we can change it. So therefore we have to assume what he's saying. Not assume, it's true what he's saying. In this I didn't finish all that. Let's just looking at more depth in the mind now, the contents of our mind. Like I said, there are three categories. According to Buddhist psychology, there are three categories of states of mind. There are millions of states of mind. Millions of them. But there are three categories into which they all fall. Those that are neurotic, delusional, distorted, disturbing, which are the voices of ego, I like to call them that, which we consider normal, therefore don't ever question. And like we talked already, anger, fears, jealousy, depression, you name it, these ordinary words. Then there are those that are positive or virtuous or wholesome or useful or beneficial, and they're the source of our happiness. Kindness, love, compassion, these ordinary words. The third category, these are called neutral insofar as they're neither virtuous in their category nor non-virtuous, meaning they're like concentration, good memory. Everybody needs those. One of them is called mindfulness, which is like good memory. It's not a holy thing. Mindfulness just means not forgetting what you're doing from moment to moment. Well, as Lama Zopa says, thieves need mindfulness. You know, it's just the capacity to not forget what you're doing. And if you're really going to go deep into your mind and unpack and unravel its contents, you need really good focus, you need really good concentration, you need really good attention, you need really good mindfulness. These are all different states of mind. And these are cultivated to an incredible degree of subtlety in this concentration technique that these Indians invented 3,000 years ago. So there are these three categories. Those that are neurotic and delusional and make you crazy and cause you to harm others. Those that are virtuous and reasonable and positive and effective. And this is where he makes this massive distinction. And this is why the conclusion from the Buddha's point of view, having done the job in his own mind, he's rid the mind of all the rubbish because he says they're misconceptions and therefore you can remove them, which seems a bit abstract to us because we just think, as you know, as Neil's saying, they're natural, that it's happened spontaneously, you know. And then the positive ones, to grow those to this limitless degree. Are we communicating with this concept? So therefore you've got to know your mind. It's obvious. If the mind is the main source of your happiness, and the mind is your main source of your suffering, and you want happiness and don't want suffering, it's a no-brainer. You better learn about your mind, baby. and learn these techniques to help you go in deep. And don't think it's cosmic. It is not cosmic. It's intense and focused and rigorous and disciplined. This is why we've got such an addiction in our culture about spiritual teachings being kind of cosmic and mystical and beyond comprehension, that we make this fantasy nonsense about what meditation is, you know. I mean, everyone's allowed to use that word and define it as they wish. I'm using the Buddha's approach here. So it sounds easy enough, like if you again, the simple analogy, the weeds are all the rubbish and the flowers are all the goodness. I know it's simplistic, but it's a good analogy. If the job is to identify all the weeds and pull them out, and to grow the flowers and develop them, this sounds pretty clear. But obviously, again, using the analogy, if that's the job out there, you know, you can look at the garden until the cows come home. This is where a misconception about being mindful as meditation. People think by being mindful, you can do this job. But being mindful means being focused, not losing your memory, not wandering off in your own head, training your mind to be very focused so you don't forget what you're doing. You're training it to be really harnessed, really focused, really clear. So you can have really good mindfulness. You can be looking at that garden out there and, you know, and being very mindful of it, even so well that you can even, you know, replicate it in a drawing. That's possible. But what good is that? Because if you, once on the basis of being mindful of what's in your garden, by looking and paying attention, on the basis of seeing what's in the garden, how can you learn to do something about it if you don't know, if you don't understand botany? The point I'm making is this: you've got your garden full of weeds and herbs and flowers and vegetables, right? But you don't know botany. So no matter how much you remember what's there, how well you can draw the cauliflowers and the roses and identify them all visually without knowing their names, what good is that? So what is the point of being mindful but not knowing really deeply how to identify all the millions of states of mind that are all mixed together, quite tricky, you know? We only know we're angry when it's really violent. We only know we're depressed when you can't get out of bed one morning. But to go deep into your mind and to understand the conceptual stories at a much subtler level that are really much more nuanced and more subtle and more mixed together, it's very hard to do this. So we have to learn, you know, we're choosing. If we choose to, say, be a Buddhist, you're choosing Buddha's assessment of the mind, which is like Buddhist botany, if you like. You've got to have a way to understand the contents of your mind. And that's the difficult part. Because, you know, right now, the love and the attachment, for example, these two, attachment's under the negative heading and love is under the positive heading. But the trouble is they don't come in, you know, you don't have your weeds in that end of the garden and your flowers in the other. Then it's easy to pull the weeds out, isn't it? But they're all mixed together. They're mixed together so we can't differentiate between them. And that's the tricky part. So if I say, I love Neil, love is a positive state of mind. It's altruistic. It's necessarily virtuous. It's beneficial. It's useful. It brings me joy and happiness, and it causes me to want to help Neil. It's perfect. We all want more of that in the world. But why is it difficult to grow it? Because it's polluted at the moment with my attachment, which is necessarily I-based. Well, this attachment, you know, at a gross level, if you're a junkie falling on the floor overdosing on heroin or alcohol, it's easy to got attachment. It's an extreme level of it. But attachment's way more subtle, way more nuanced, deeper down, you know, harder to recognize as you get more deeply into your mind. And this is the trouble, it's the pollution. It makes a mess of the love. So if I say I'm in love with Neil, we know it's this blissful feeling, Neil looks completely divine, finally I've found happiness, we're going to be together till we're 80-something, whatever. That's 99% attachment talking. And so naturally, okay, love is defined as, may Neil be happy. It's a wish that someone be happy. If someone is happy, you delight in their happiness. That's what they call love. And of course you grow that. You have to grow that for your sake and the sake of others. Compassion is empathy with someone suffering. That's another positive state of mind, pretty obvious. We have both of those. We have them, you know. But but the trouble is we don't notice the attachment. We don't notice this intense I-based, ego-based, fear-based, neurotic craving and neediness in there. It's really hard to recognize it when, especially, the love is there and everything's so lovely and wonderful. So the millisecond, so as long as we're together, let's say, me and Neil basically is kind and loving and thoughtful and generous and does what I want every moment, which in other words, he satisfies my attachment, then of course it's easy to love him. It's easy to want him to be happy. But then we move in together and then the problems start. You know, he farts in the sheets instead of the toilet. He leaves the toilet seat up. I hear that men always leave toilet seats up and women makes them crazy. I've heard that. Is that right, ladies?
Yes.
That's so funny.
Beating them down pisses them off.
That's right, there you go. So the thing is, when we're in love and there's a distance between us and I get dressed up in my best clothing and smell best when we see each other and it's all gorgeous, and you get my point. Attachment's gone nuts, right? Attachment is over-exaggerated neediness for somebody, and there's Neil, and I completely believe he's going to be the cause of all my happiness. The story's gone mad in our minds. We can't even recognise it all. He's just gone completely berserk. And of course I love him. Of course I want him to be happy. I'll give my life for him. But as long as he does what my attachment wants. But that's the trouble. As soon as we get closer and closer, we move in together, and then as the troubles start. Because we're human, that means because we have attachment. So the millisecond my attachment doesn't get what it wants, that means he mightn't look at me perfectly. He mightn't answer me when I say something. He might, not do the dishes nicely. He might come home late. And then attachment goes berserk. Because it can't cope with anything that isn't perfect. And that's when aversion comes, and the jealousy comes, and the pain comes, and the hurt comes. But the trouble is with this, we don't know its attachment's the problem until it doesn't get what it wants. So the only way to, again, what attachment is, like I said before, it's really hard to see it until it's extreme. And we only think in our culture you've got a problem with it when you're a junkie. So basically junkie, addict, they're extreme words for what Buddha would call simply attachment, a craving for something. But we have it at subtler levels, That's all. So the Buddha's view is much more nuanced than our view. So we only think you've got a problem with attachment when it's really serious, like alcohol or drugs, or you're jumping on girls every day and you can't get enough. That's when it's extreme. But that never being satisfied is the energy of attachment. Then it hankers after something, and then it gloms onto something on the outside. Then it makes the thing look more delicious. Then it believes that when I get it, I'll get happy. And then it has a panic attack when you don't get it. So it's really hard to see what the Buddha is saying is the suffering of this attachment, because it seems to us just like normal human behaviour. So attachment is neediness, is dissatisfaction, it's the sense that I'm not enough, it's the sense of always wanting something more. And then when it doesn't get what it wants, anger is the response. So that'll what happen when he and I get close. Suddenly I'll get upset, I'll get angry, I'll get irritated, I'll get annoyed. They're all polite words for anger. They're all polite words for the response when attachment doesn't get what it wants. So as long as he keeps fulfilling my needs and being kind and loving to me, then I won't get upset because he's satisfying my needs. But as soon as he stops doing that, even mildly, then I freak out, anger comes. And that's when the problems start. So we don't notice there's attachment until it doesn't get what it wants. That's what's so tricky. I always use a simple example. We both like chocolate cake. We go out for chocolate cake. Oh, we like chocolate cake. But look what happens when carrot cake comes. So his view might be, oh, that's cool, I can handle carrot cake. And mine will be, hey, I ordered chocolate cake, get upset. So being upset, this is where it's so shocking too. The ordinary things like upset, annoyed, irritated, they're all polite words for anger. So when we understand this one, the Buddha is saying is that constant, deep in our bones, at this subtler level, and it can be in a gross level as well, there's this constant neediness, constant dissatisfaction, constant wanting something more, constant wanting, all the time a kind of an emotional hunger, an emotional hunger really is what attachment is. And it can be subtle, it can be gross, depending on the person. They're always looking for something. And the obvious level is the objects of the senses. There's a much subtler level of it as well, we'll talk about. So then as long as it gets what it wants, and it's also instinctive, your mummy didn't teach you this, you get born with it. So, as long as you didn't get, when it doesn't get what it wants, that's when instantaneously this aversion arises. There's these two fundamental states of mind, attachment and aversion. So attachment's kind of, oh yeah, that's lovely, and you go towards it. Aversion is, oh, that's disgusting, and you go away from it. That's 1,000 times a day. But attachment's the default mode, always wanting more, always wanting something, assuming utterly, without question, that when I get it, that'll trigger some happy feelings. So there's going to be the person, the cake, the nice sound, the smell, the thing, the new bag, the new job, the new boyfriend. These are the obvious levels of it, and we don't question, I think, in our psychological models this. We would just say it's natural, meaning you'd be unnatural if you didn't have it. But Buddha, because of his own inner work, happens to point it out. That as you go deeper, you recognise this, and it's the actual pain of dissatisfaction. So therefore, it's always causing us to manipulate, to get the nice things, to get Neil to do what I want, to get the weather to be good, to get the food to be good. It is natural, but when it's driven by attachment, it's kind of difficult because the tiniest thing can go wrong, you have a mental breakdown. We know this. We know this, like Neil said, it's natural. But the Buddha says we can become deeply familiar with this stuff and train our minds to change it. And not for some holy reason, but for your own sake.
How do you train the mind
This is what we're talking about.
to not react?
This is what we're discussing. That's all. Every word I'm saying in this room.
Yeah, but it goes to a certain point, you recognize it, and you've isolated.
This is why you need
But then what?
You need constant. This is why you have to have concentration. Which is why I talked about this meditation technique that these Indians invented. Practicing even 3 minutes a day, focusing your mind, with not following the thoughts. We'll do some. I'll give an example of how to do it. Then what you're learning to do is see your thoughts more clearly, and then slowly, slowly, if you're using the Buddhist model, you'll recognise the attachment, the irritation, the anger, the hurt, and we're talking real subtle levels here. In advanced practice we're talking, but this is the start of the process. So the logical thing is if you're using Buddhist model to describe to yourself in your own mind, that's attachment, that's aversion, that's jealousy, blah, 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 then obviously once you understand what the thought arises in the mind, what it is, and this is already pretty subtle, then you try not to follow it. So if you're driving the car, you know the rules of driving a car, and one of the rules is you don't wander off into the wrong lane at 120 kilometres an hour. So you've got to be very noticing what's going on, isn't it? The second you catch yourself, the second you recognise what's going on, and you say, then what? Well, then what? You'd instantly apply an antidote, which is get back in the right lane. So when it's the mind, and I'm about to shout at Panos, because I'm annoyed because he didn't do what I wanted, you know, then you catch it. You catch it and don't follow it. That's the real ideal of practice. You know your mind ever more intimately, ever more clearly, and this is a long, ongoing job. I mean, ever more subtle. Then at least when you recognise it, the first level of practice is at least don't speak it out. So the very first level of practice is basically control your body and control your speech. So the reason Buddha would even first level, remember we began talking about what the basic level of morality, behaviour. The first level, entry level, junior school, is behaviour. Don't worry about your mind yet. So given that my killing, stealing, and jumping on the wrong partner, and lying, simple a few actions of body and speech, given that they're driven by these delusions, right? They're driven by the neuroses. You don't kill out of love. You don't lie out of, generosity. You understand? All the neurotic behaviour, once we recognise that they're just the servants of what goes on in the mind, the very first level of practice is control your body and speech. And then you have the luxury of now becoming your own therapist, as Lama Yeshe puts it, observing all the thoughts that motivate your body and speech. So that's the next real level of practice, where you now start to know your mind well, based on getting some decent concentration in meditation, based on understanding Buddha's explanation of these thoughts. The job day to day is learning to recognise them before they explode out of control. I mean, it's an intense job, full on, but it's just, that's the theory of it. That's the theory of it. Does it make sense, theoretically? I mean,
it's when you can practice non-reaction and not let them affect you, but then they sneak back.
Oh, massively, hugely, to a degree here. I mean, if we're talking about in the Buddhist view, the perspective is to get rid of them all completely. I mean, don't hold your breath. He would say it will take many, many lifetimes, because it's that subtle, the level to which we can go, But even the general principle we can see. So not to have a misconception because you did it once, you got rid of it all. No way. It goes real deep. But that's the principle. And it's not complicated. It's just hard work. And you have to want to do it, because when you're angry and upset with somebody, everything in you is just driving you to say those words. It's really hard to really follow the thoughts and not vomit everything out. I mean, it's intensely difficult, especially when we've got very strong habits. Isn't it? I mean, intense. But that's the theory of it. That's the idea. And of course, this is why, again, Neil's point was a good one. When it's something like you're suddenly overwhelmed by this chaos in a room with a bunch of people fighting and yelling, let's say, it seems almost impossible to imagine that you could keep your mind steady in the face of that. It seems almost impossible to us. So then but that's the more we do know our mind, the more practice we do, then of course it's possible. And that means even to the point where you're about to have a crash on the freeway. Of course you can keep your mind steady. Of course you can keep your mind stable, but that takes immense practice. I mean, to that degree we can do it, But slowly. Don't hold our breath. Are we communicating, people? So, okay, so so the thing to remember again is this is not punitive or moralistic. The reason behind, Buddhist practice is first for your own sake. First to realise that when we start to understand that my chaos and my attachment and my fears and my depression and my jealousy are what cause me pain. Yes, people do terrible things to each other. And this is where it gets a bit of a minefield, because then, then we can imagine, oh, you mean, you sort of, if you're in you see terrible suffering on this earth, people abusing each other and harming each other. And then you go, oh, well, you mean they're suffering because of their own past karma, and they're suffering because of their own anger. Well, why should I help them? It's not like that at all. I mean, it's not like that. Karma and the mind are Buddha's explanation of why things happen. Christians have a different view. Communists have a different view. Everybody has a different view. So this is the view a Buddhist would take, which is why that response of those young women, Or even I remember a friend of mine in Tibet, Jigdrol, years ago. In '87, there was the first kind of mini uprising against the Chinese communists by all the Tibetans. The first one was in 1950 and then 59, right? So then, no, 1959. So what happened was, he told me he was about 17 at the time, and he started to demonstrate. All the young monks and nuns were the main. They were the kind of the radicals. They were the ones doing all the demonstrating. So when you think of demonstration, you think of anger. People with placards shouting and yelling. So it sort of seems natural, you demonstrate because you're angry. So I remember asking, he'd escaped to Nepal, and he told me about this suffering. He'd been in these demonstrations, he'd got arrested, he got tortured, then he got released again, then he demonstrated again, then his friend had his head blown off, and then he thought by this point he better escape, so he escaped to Nepal. And then he was telling me about this, and it was, since he had escaped, his father got murdered, brother got murdered, lots of suffering. I mean, it's pretty intense what's happening in Nepal, in India, in Tibet, sorry. So then naturally I said to him, this is like 30 years ago, I said, oh, Jigdrol, do you ever get angry? And his answer is literally like this. He just laughed at me casually. He said, Robina, what for? He said, it's our own fault. Now that's a shocking answer. But your rabbi would have said, that rabbi would have said the same thing. Because he had the view, in other words, this Buddhist, and this is the thing you've got to remember, in Asia, in India and Tibet, therefore in Asia, this view of karma is their default mode, They might not understand it. I'm not saying they've studied it, but that's their default mode. Whereas for us, being materialists, our default mode, even if we're good Christians or Jews, is still, we're materialists, the mind is the brain, mummy made us, and the outside world is the cause of our suffering. So his view is like shocking. What are you angry? What for, Robina? So then you have to think, well, okay, let's analyse what anger is. What is anger then? Let's analyse, what does anger say? Well, when Neil doesn't do what I want, which is attachment, this frantic craving, deep inside, hard to see it. When he doesn't fulfill attachment's needs, then naturally I'll have a panic attack. How dare he? Why did you not listen to me? I didn't do that. Why do you do that? We get intensely hurt. I mean, we get pain and hurt and freak it out. So what anger says is, what's the philosophy of anger? It's saying, how dare you do that to me? I don't deserve it. It's the voice of ego grasping. It's the deepest voice of this little unhappy me who didn't get what she wanted. And I'm not, don't make that sound mean. Like, I mean, they're these Tibetans. You'd imagine, we would say, they are allowed, we'd say you're allowed to be angry. All this intense suffering, those young women, Jigdrol, you'd think, well, they're allowed, our view is you're allowed to be angry. Well, technically, yes, you're allowed to do anything you like. But the Buddhist point is, look at what it causes. So this is a minefield. When you see, if just me not getting what I wanted and Neil doesn't look at me 24 hours a day, then you can think, oh, shut up, Robina, something so ridiculous, grow up. But when it's anger in the face of intense suffering, like poverty and suffering and terrorism and the latest maniacs, ruining the world, then you'd think, well, anger's a healthy attitude. But this is where we need to really do some analysis. I remember Martin Luther King said, he was amazing, He said, it's okay to be angry. He meant it's okay to find fault. You must find fault. Look, there is racism, there is sexism, there is terrorism, there's shocking things in the world. That's intelligence. That's not called anger. That's ridiculous. That's not anger. That's intelligence. Look at, there is a war, there is a this, there is a that. But what anger is this natural, as we feel, response, how dare that happen? And then the moment we have compassion for one group, we then have anger towards the people who are causing it. This is what we think is utterly natural. Whereas even Martin Luther King's response, he said it's all right to find fault, but then you say, how can I help? What can I do to help? Now that's called compassion. So yes, see the suffering in the world, but the Buddha's view of karma